the Shackman decrees and patronage, how did you see that evolve during the years when Mayor Richard J. Daley was in office?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you raised that question, Gary, because I was a reformer, and again, in writing my book, I've gone back to my great-grandfather's days, and I'm struck by how the paradoxes, how obvious reforms produced unexpected results. My father, had 30,000 Republicans to replace with good Democrats. That gave him the power with which to reform state government. We didn't have to compete with Republicans on their terms. Money, we could compete with those precinct captains we got with state jobs. I remember one newly employed state worker assuring my father that he had been a lifelong Democrat ever since he got his state job.
No doubt it was true.
Yeah. I can't remember the question now, but
the question is the Shackman decree patronage. Oh. What did you observe of the patronage system?
Well, this happened with my great-grandfather too. He placed 40,000 Republican postmasters. Well, when we no longer had that kind of patronage, and those workers, we used to go by the ward meetings every night and exhort the faithful to get everybody registered and out to vote the Democratic Party. When we no longer had them, then we had to start raising the money by different means, by pay-to-pay. So it was, the results of that particular reform were kind of mixed. And it changed our politics radically. I saw this in other instances as a reformer when our slate-making sessions back in those days, for example, were always closed off to the people, like the Constitutional Convention of 1787. As soon as you open the doors to let in the sunshine, you let in the lobbyists and all the interest groups, and the money starts pouring in. Well, there's continuing push, on that front also. I was not really. I was in Springfield. I was in Washington. I was not privy to the sort of inner workings of Richard J's administration, except by working with these individuals I started to mention, who were really extraordinary. The city planner, whose name I can't remember, was extraordinary, and the cultural affairs gal. There were really extraordinary people. No remote possibility of them being influenced by money. But then you get to a Charlie Swivel or somebody else, and it might be different in a different venue.
Patty Bowler was famous for saying, "Chicago ain't ready for reform," and your career in politics was very associated with reform. What about Chicago today? Do you think Chicago is ready for reform? What kind of reform should it be ready for?
Well, Patty Bowler, if we leave him, the only person who ever beat him was my uncle, Waller. But I lived in his ward. So when I was making the rounds during campaigns, ward meeting after ward meeting after ward meeting, I'd go to Patty's. His was in his old speakeasy. Right. Where he'd once, during Prohibition, had shot 2 cops who hadn't known enough to mind their business. I remember Patty Patty introducing me for my little speech. He was waving a stein of beer, and there was beer flowing all over the place, and a ukulele was banging away in the background. Of course, it was full of smoke and talk. And after I'd made my little speech exhorting the faithful to get everybody out to vote, I sat down, and Patty said, "Why, you know, the little shit ain't so bad after all, but he ought to drop that turd." In those days, I was running as Adlai III. Well, I took his advice, and from then on, it was just Adlai. I remember Daley calling me one day and saying, "What are we going to do about that alderman?" And I said, "What are we going to do about it? You're the county chairman. What are you going to do about him?" And, well, the result was nothing got done about Patty. God, what a character. Chicago ain't ready for reform. Well, I don't know what reform means. Having been a reformer all my life, I see all sorts of adverse consequences of reform. And yet, in the country and at large, and my book again works on this. In fact, we created the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy to try to address weaknesses in democratic systems of government. But I think at all levels, the greatest need for reform is getting, the money out. But I don't hear a lot of clamoring for that at the city level.
Well, maybe what I should do next is I'd like to go through the key dates in your own career and ask you first about any interactions you had with Mayor Daley in connection with those elections. And then we can go back and go through your whole career in greater detail.
Okay.
But let me start with your father's bids for President of the United States. And can you remember what role Mayor Daley played in those contexts?
Well, in the '52 campaign, I was in the Marine Corps en route to Korea, so I really don't have any recollections of that campaign. I was, though, going to law school, involved in '64. I don't remember much involvement. I do remember that the mayor, in effect, seconded to my father a cousin of his, Jim Daley, who was a plainclothes Chicago policeman. Mm-hmm. And that was security for the president in those days. But, and apart from what I said a moment ago about him calling regularly to find out what's going on back home, I don't think there was much involvement in either of the presidential campaigns, and I do remember pretty well, the people who were doing most of the planning, the speech writing. There wasn't much of a fit there, really, going from city to nation and to the world. Daley was always local. He was very much. Although there were times when I noticed if a president of the United States needed a little support in Congress, he could call up Richard J. Daley, and that happened once in my case, and get a quick response. Daley was a loyalist, very disciplined. But I think in terms of the policy or the sort of management of those two campaigns, he really wasn't involved.
Well, what about 1960 was a year when there was a boom to have your father run a third time, and that would have been a hometown candidate. Mayor Daley is associated with the candidacy of John F. Kennedy, but do you remember anything about whether?
Yes, I remember quite a lot. I was at the convention, and it was very difficult because my father was strongly encouraged by passionate supporters
Like Eleanor Roosevelt.
Including Eleanor Roosevelt, to whom he was devoted and indebted. He felt that because he was the titular leader of the party and because of his obligations to these faithful supporters, that he should be neutral. I remember at Libertyville when Jack Kennedy came, he was ready to offer him the Secretary of State position, which is what my father would have liked if he would just support him for president, but he wouldn't do it, so he forfeited that, that office. I'm sorry, what was the question again?
Question with regard to the actually running as president. Did Daley stay away from that? Or?
It was very, 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 very difficult for Daley because he really was devoted to and indebted to my father. But he also liked the Kennedys. You know, they were Catholics. The Kennedys had a place in Chicago, the Merchandise Mart, and my father encouraged everybody to go off and support the candidates of their choice. So Daley did exactly what he was encouraged to do. And then at the very end, at where San Francisco, Los Angeles, I guess, this wave of humanity converged from across the country and literally broke down the doors to the convention, demanding another nomination. Eleanor Roosevelt, took to the floor, and there was I
remember that so well.
Brilliant nominating speech by Senator.
Was it McCarthy?
McCarthy, yeah. And my father got got a little bit carried away, and he started visiting delegations and making noises like he might like to run again. And that caused Daley some bitterness because he had been encouraged to support Kennedy. And now all of a sudden the Illinois candidate, his former governor, was showing some interest. Of course, it was never going to happen. It was totally unrealistic. But I know for a fact that Daley felt some resentment, though my father did not. He did not resent anybody who had gone and done what he had encouraged them to do. And then he went on to campaign strenuously all across the country for John F. Kennedy. And incidentally, in the '56 convention, he threw open the nomination for vice president, hoping that John F. Kennedy would get it. But the nomination for president was foreordained, and he wanted some excitement. And so it was very, very close. But Estes Kefauver won the nomination. And that was very good for John F. Kennedy. It brought him to the nation's attention. And he was implicated in a failed campaign for vice president. I think that blew off, blew over pretty fast. The very first stop that Bobby Kennedy made on the campaign trail was at our home for a rally in Libertyville. Thereafter, there always was what was known as the Irish Mafia in the Kennedy White House. They were always a little suspicious, a little fearful that there might be something might come out of left wing from this enormously popular figure in the Democratic Party. But he and Kennedy got along very well personally. And that goes taking us a little beyond Daley. Daley was close to Kennedy.